Hello, this is Beline Carlson, secondary generalist at Nicolai School. I am here to talk about action and expression, which is a concept from Universal Design for Learning. This is an idea that helps build skills in students along with content acquisition, and it's something that we should think about because it increases student engagement. It gives kids something to do and something to hang on to while you are teaching them the content that we are mandated to teach them according to the curriculum, and building skills for them so that they can go on to take their learning and make it portable, which is outside of the classroom. So our intention here is to look at the tools for skill building and content acquisition. And I'm hoping that everyone can come away from this video with a new tech tool or an idea for a student project for their classroom. So the question is, how can you align skill and content acquisition? So how do you take what a student is supposed to be learning, like the nuts and bolts, the facts and figures that a student should be learning and acquiring, while they are building skills which will serve them as they move out into the world? And how can you be flexible with this so that students can make the choices that they need to make and thereby become more engaged with their own learning and more empowered to take control of their learning so that they can um, so that your learning doesn't just exist inside the classroom but can exist in the whole world for the student. So the UDL network is Universal Design for Learning, and I have a link here if you look at the slides, which should be on the website. You can go to this website and find 1,000,001 tools, and there's under action and expression, there's a ton of different tools that you can use, and I've outlined a few of them here. Oops. And I went to the website. This is what it looks like. It's from CAST and udlguidelines.cast.org. But going back to the slides, this is an example of one that you can use. This is a character development plus expository essay, this is pretty basic. Most English teachers would be thinking about this when giving assignments to their students. So our literature standards asks us to have students learn about character development and identify, using evidence from the text, identify how characters grow and change over the course of a story. That's part of our literature standards. And then on top of that, our expository essay is part of our English language, our ELA standards. So writing a 5-paragraph expository essay. So if you combine those two, then you are able to hit more standards with one project. And this is a 2-point rubric, or a 2 criteria, 1-point rubric. You are outlining just one example. Like, you're talking about, like, how does a student meet these standards? So a 3 on the rubric is the student has met the standard at grade level. So for character development, it says student clearly describes changes in character using evidence from the text. That is the grade level standard. You can find it in the curriculum if you go online. And then for an expository essay, I've added student uses perfect grammar and spelling. That's my expectation with all my assignments because my students use tech tools, so they should be able to see the little red squiggly or little blue squiggly line underneath a word or a phrase and know that they have a problem and know that they need to fix that. So I expect students to turn things into me that are perfect or close to perfect. Then student introduces and defends a clear thesis is the other part of this criteria. So that is the grade level expectation for that. And then the tools I have are Google Docs or Word. I prefer my students to use Google Docs because it's easier for them to share it with me within our district's network. So here we have the content standard, which is the character development, and then the communication skill, which is the expository essay. And these are both standards that we find in the curriculum. To make this easier for students, you might consider having a list of available apps. So when you give them an assignment, you would give them a list of available apps. Possibly, if you're just looking at character development and you don't care whether or not they're writing an essay, you might consider a graphic novel or they could create a Venn diagram, or there's a lot of other things that they could do. If you Google the term creative response online, you will come up with a whole bunch of different projects, and I have a list of those documents on my website, or you can email me and I can give them to you. Mostly with that, you're looking for clarity, evidence that the student understands what character development is, that they are using evidence from the text, and then just I always add in elements of art and design in order to create an engaging experience for the audience. So that is a criteria. That's my expectation of my students. They're going to be thinking about how they're communicating and making it a palatable, engaging experience for their audience, which this video is probably more like a 2 on the rubric, if in my opinion. So for social studies, you are looking at facts. You're looking at historical facts that students should be able to look up in a textbook or online. And I have this little meme here: why do I need a teacher when I've got Google? The big thing is that we should be teaching skills that students can't Google. And you'll hear that big complaint from my students is like, well, I couldn't look it up on Google. I didn't know what to look for. And it's because I'm asking for higher level critical thinking skills. Anyone can memorize facts and figures, and often they do. And that's one big caveat with this approach to teaching. It is research-based best practice. It is more engaging for students, but the students who are going to struggle the most with it are the ones who are accustomed to being able to study for the test and then get an A on the test and then move on. And I have literally had students say that to me in class. All I want to do is study for the test, ace the test, and never think about any of this again. So if you're able to do that, basically, you're teaching students that skill. And I'm not saying memorization isn't important. I do ask for map tests occasionally. I do ask students to memorize things occasionally, but it's one skill. And if that's the only skill you're teaching, then you're basically, you're not giving them anything other than, one skill, plus that's a skill that they can rely on their cell phones for. And most of them do have cell phones. So this is a Revolutionary War assignment, and building a timeline is also a social studies standard that we should be meeting. My recommendation for this is that you give students the option of using specific tech tools. So Prezi or Visme, Canvas, If you go to the slides, then all of these accounts are listed. You don't have to be the expert in these using these apps. You can be an expert consumer. So you can tell a student whether they've used whatever tool they're using. You don't even need to know how to use it. You can say, you haven't used this well. This is confusing to me. This color scheme is off. You certainly are looking for facts. You're looking to see whether or not they've done their research and whether or not they've provided examples of good resources. So I always ask for a bibliography on these things or hyperlinked resources in the assignment. But as the consumer of media, you don't have to be the expert in how they use that. And as a matter of fact, some of these, like Visme and Canva, they were introduced to me by students who found them on their own. And that is absolutely perfect. Like, you don't need to be the expert on these things. So science isn't my personal forte, but it is something that I find interesting because it creates, it has the perfect example of why facts and figures don't need to be our focus on these things. Pluto. Like Pluto, when I was a kid growing up, Pluto was a planet, and then it became not a planet, and then it's a planet again. And I'm not sure if it's a planet now or not, but I can pick up my phone and I can look that up. So I don't need students to memorize whether or not Pluto is a planet. I need students to be able to research whether or not Pluto's a planet. I need them to be able to come up with a good, they need to know good sources from bad sources, and they need to be able to communicate their information to me in an efficient and engaging way. So for this one, we've got cell structure and graphic representation, and I've got a list of resources here that students can use. Again, PictoChart and Infogram, those were tools introduced to me by students who found them, and they just looked for a good Google search, like, how do I create a chart, blah, 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 blah. And these things popped up, and they used them because most of these things have a free account. And it's, again, a 1-point rubric, so I'm telling students what the passing score is. If a student gets a straight 3s on the rubric, that's a 90% in my book because they've met the standard. So in my opinion, they should get an A. I don't know what a 4 looks like. A 4 is going to go above and beyond whatever this grade level standard is. A 2 means that they've almost met it, but they haven't quite yet. And you have to kind of do the math to figure out how that translates into percentage points to stick into Power School. There's lots of different ways to do that. But as long as they're making an attempt, like straight ones is like thanks for playing, and as long as you make an attempt, then that's, in my book, that's a 60%. So as long as they're trying to pass these things, as long as they're making a strong attempt at each one of these criteria, then they won't fail. They can't fail a rubric. If obviously if something's missing and they didn't try, then that's where the failure comes in. I also have a policy in my classroom that students are able to redo projects or assignments all the way up until the end of the semester for full credit. So if they do one of these things and they sort of miss something, we can have a conversation about it and they can redo it and turn it in, because the learning to me is more important. Like, there's no such thing as a summative assignment or a summative score. I want them constantly to be thinking about, how can I work harder to make this better? What can I do? What can I do differently? What sort of resources could I pull in? The other thing is that we need to be thinking about, like, what are we assessing? Like, are we assessing compliance? Are we assessing learning? Like, what does that mean to assess learning? In my opinion, learning is a process, and it's not something that we can really assess even with an assignment for a student. Like, whether or not a student has actually learned a fact, we don't know that until we ask them 20 years later, perhaps, whether or not they've learned that piece. And by that time, maybe they forgot it. So we just are looking at the project itself and assessing the project, and then asking the students to go back to and revise it. And then the other part of it is that with this type of project, I'm not up in front of the room telling students how to do things step by step. I want them to work through that and figure that out themselves. The teaching comes in when I assess the project that they've turned in and say, hey, check this out. Or you tell me, how is this fitting on the rubric? You tell me where you think that this should lie. And, as Hattie says, like, student self-assessment is really one of the best ways to increase student learning. So, waiting and doing that heavy teaching, that one-on-one conferencing towards the end is really more effective than putting your time in up front to give the students direct instruction. So this is a math project, and I love this meme here. Like 90s teachers, you aren't always going to have a calculator in your pocket. Well, I do always have a calculator in my pocket. And if for some reason I should, not have a calculator in my pocket, then probably solving a quadratic equation isn't going to help me out. Like, I've got bigger problems, if you know what I mean. This is one where students can identify and use appropriate procedures for independently solving quadratic equations, and students use analog or digital tools to present their findings to peers. So here you can have students learn a skill, learn a math skill, learn how to figure something out, but then their goal is not to just learn it and pass the test. Their goal is to turn around and use their tools to teach somebody else. So we can have students create, we have one student here who has a hard time remembering a skill from one day to the next. And he's got some specific issues that cause that problem. But we're working towards having him make his own, like, Khan Academy uh, videos, so that he's learning, he's teaching himself, he's making videos, maybe even for other students, but then he can go back and look at his own videos and learn his math from his own video that he's already made. And that's going to give that feedback, that memory is going to be more ingrained for him. Another thing is maybe podcasts. We have YouTube, we have Screencastify. There's lots of different things that kids can use that would have whiteboards, or create something like this where a student can create a teaching piece to teach other students, and thereby be more engaged with their learning. So when we went remote, I kind of challenged the students to, look at what they were already doing. Maybe they're working with their parents. Some of them were working. Their parents were contractors, and they started going to the job site because we weren't going to school. And I asked them to create their own presentations about what they're learning. And then I just kind of created this general rubric that had different points in here. I taught them, I created a video and gave them resources to learn about Bloom's taxonomy and asked them to create stuff that was going to be higher level Bloom's taxonomy. Then I had them, figure it out. And I had one kid make a great, hilarious little TikTok video about installing a sink. I had some other kids talking about taking care of chickens. I had kids talking about cleaning the house, and cooking was really popular. But I had no idea what they were going to come up with. I just asked them to create a presentation, some kind of presentation, some sort of learning piece that was showing what they were doing, what they were learning in their daily life, because they were at home doing things, and I couldn't really control that environment. So the rubric works out really well for that. So why do we want to switch things up this much? I mean, this is a radical departure for a lot of teachers. And the big question is that are you teaching things that can't be Googled? That is Brian Buffington's catchphrase. He has a little T-shirt that says, I teach things that can't be Googled. And the reason why we would want to do that is because it's kind of a waste of time for you and for the kids and for everyone else to teach things to them that they have the tools to figure that out on their own. The average 12-year-old now has more knowledge than adults even 20 years ago. And we want to say, oh, they don't have any common sense, or kids today, they're so dumb, blah, 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 blah. Well, first of all, people have been talking that way for the last 6,000 years, legitimately. Sumerian tablets have had parents irritated with their students. But as far as content knowledge is concerned, most kids know more than adults did, even when I was a kid. Just because they have access to all this information. We're saturated with media. Television is just the tip of the iceberg. Most kids have the internet at their fingertips, and they can find anything out. So the things that are really useful and have always been really useful. I mean, this is a string of uh, philosophy going back to Dewey, is that we should be teaching kids goal setting, project map planning, time management, communication skills, research, technology fluency, collaboration, reflection, and self-assessment. I mean, these are the skills that students really need, and they're the portable skills that kids can take out of a classroom and apply to any setting that they're in. They can they can take those skills. If you're teaching them those skills with whatever your content is, then you don't have to try to predict what kids need to know or what they're going to do in 20 or 30 years. They can figure it out on their own. They can learn that content on their own if you've taught them these basic skills. So some questions for discussion, because this is different, and people might not think that this applies to them. So for an elementary teacher, these are things that you can incorporate into your classroom as well. Like, our elementary here has a great little must do, may do menu where students have a choice about what they're working on what part of the day. They're very independent. And then when they finish something, they put a little sticker on it, and it kind of models an actual job where you don't have somebody telling you from, in 45-minute increments what you're supposed to be working on at any given time. You just know that you need to have this project done by a certain time, and then you have to figure out how you're going to get that done. So even going down to the little guys, like kindergarten, all the way up through, that skill set can be applied. This sort of approach gives an opportunity for teaming across departments. If I know that the science department is doing lab reports, why don't I incorporate that into my ELA standards? Those kids are writing. It's technical writing has a far higher lexile than most literature that kids read. So how about if we spend a little bit of time putting those things together, which is going to mean that in my classroom and in the science classroom, if they're putting those things together, then kids have 2 hours a day to work on a single project instead of having to break things up again. Digital versus analog tools is another question. Well, we don't have that technology in our school, or we don't have access. Kids don't have access to that at home. And that's fine too. I mean, this type of project-based learning was invented way before the internet was invented. So there are lots of projects out there. What dioramas and models and posters and presentations, those types of things can be incorporated into your classroom, and students can be working on that. Visual presentation doesn't have to mean digital. It can mean a poster or those trifold boards, all kinds of different things. And a piece of work, an artwork or a collage, that can be incorporated in as well. So for project-based learning, you will need to use some scaffolding. That was one thing that was really frustrating to me when I first started out, is I didn't understand why the kids didn't get it. Like, I'm like, you need to create a project, you need to make a presentation or make a skit or something. And they really honestly didn't know how to start. So if you're going from a traditional classroom where you're passing out worksheets or giving questions, in a textbook, and you're trying to move to a project-based learning, you're going to have some scaffolding. You're going to have to give them explicit instructions on how to start. Some of those kids are going to take this and they're going to take off with it. They're going to run. They're creative kids. They are looking for that opportunity to change. And again, the kids that are going to be dragging their feet the hardest are the ones that are really academically successful in that traditional model, where they're good at the 5-paragraph essay, they're good at the worksheet, they're good at passing the tests, and they are not going to want to have anything to do with this. My advice is to push through that, because you are really doing them a disservice by not having them complete projects. So push through that resistance. The curating exemplars, like, you can find a ton of student exemplars online. If you just Google it, and for whatever it is that you're working on. And then also think about saving them as you go along. And then the other thing is, think about doing some of these projects yourself. And being really deliberate about how you meet the standards, so that you can show students what you're looking for, regardless of what the assignment is. That was another problem that I had when I started off with this. Like, I was trained at UAA and they're like, oh, project-based learning, and this is what you should do. But when you go into it and you're faced with kids that have never done it before, and you yourself don't have any student exemplars, it's kind of like, okay, well, I know this is what we're supposed to be doing. I have no idea how this is going to roll. But don't be afraid to tell the kids that, like, this is what we're doing. This is not going to be easy. This is not going to necessarily be comfortable all the time, but we're going to push through it. And then we're going to create and curate. And then you guys are going to help me assess this. Be really open with your kids about teaching and learning. They have an opinion. They know whether or not they like your teaching. But again, don't listen to the ones that are like, just lecture us, just tell us what to do, because you're honestly very, very much doing them a disservice by telling them what to do. The one who's doing the working is the one who's doing the learning. That's something I learned in Girl Scouts, and it's so important. It's like, should be your catchphrase. If you're working harder than the kids are doing, good for you. You're working and you're learning. The kids are not. Do not spoon feed them anything. Make them work for it. And they listen. They pay attention more. If they've begged you for a lecture, they will listen to that lecture. I promise you. Yep, assessing on a rubric, new skill for some people, highly recommend it, because it teaches the kids how to assess themselves. And that's really the goal, is teaching the kids how to reflect on this stuff. And then the standards, pull those standards off the district website and put them into student language. You're an expert on reading all the teacher stuff, but you can take the teacher language, put it into student language, to the point where even a kindergartner can understand it. They know what one-digit addition is. They know what knowing their letters. They know what putting proper spaces in between the words are. You can put that into student language, so that they understand what their goal is. And they're not just treading water and trying to jump through hoops that they don't necessarily see what the goal is. They don't see the relevance, and they don't see the connection to themselves. But if you show them and tell them this is what our goal is, then they're going to be more engaged in doing that. They'll probably argue with you at some point, but you're more prepared to explain it to them when you can explicitly show them the document and show them what the goals are. And then, as far as the tools are concerned, these kids are experts in technology, the ones that we're working with. They know what they're doing. They know how to find the information. They know how to press the buttons the right way and to manipulate information back and forth. I mean, if you've ever seen some of the TikToks that these kids put together, the videos in junior high and high school, it is amazing. You don't have to worry about them not knowing how to figure out how to use the tools. They're going to figure it out. So you have them be the expert in that, and let them teach you how the tech tools work. and just, you're there just to curate and to keep everybody safe. Anyway, that is what I have. And if anybody has any questions about any of this stuff, I am delighted to help out and pass on resources and field questions. I'm certainly not an expert in anything, but I love to try to problem solve and help. Have a delightful afternoon.